Imagine inheriting a legacy so profound it threatens to crush you. David faces the impossible, stepping into his father's shoes as pastor. Doubt whispers, and the weight of expectations is immense. Witness his journey from crippling fear to finding solace in an unlikely friendship. Discover how honesty and vulnerability can bloom where perfection fails. David stood alone in the cavernous sanctuary, the silence amplifying the frantic beat of his heart. The weight of his father's legacy pressed down on him, each pew a silent judge of his worth. He longed to fill the empty pulpit with the same unwavering faith that had defined his father's sermons, but doubt gnawed at him, a relentless tide threatening to pull him under. The old church was a vessel filled with the echoes of his father's booming voice and the comforting cadence of familiar hymns, but today the sounds mocked him, for they were nothing but silence. He imagined his father standing here. He imagined Mrs. Gable standing here during one of his father's sermons. The weight of the church's expectation weighed on David. He looked to a framed picture on the wall of him and his father together, back when his father was still preaching. Now it was his responsibility. Could he live up to the standards? As David grappled with the sermon, the weight of spiritual responsibility became a heavy burden. Doubts swirled in his mind, threatening to overwhelm him. The voices of the congregation, expectant and hopeful, echoed in his mind, amplifying his anxiety. He wanted to serve them, to guide them, but the fear of failing loomed large. Footsteps broke the silence, and Mrs. Gable entered the sanctuary, her presence a gentle interruption to his spiraling thoughts. Her eyes held a quiet understanding, sensing his internal struggle. Mrs. Gable's words, soft and genuine, offered a moment of solace, yet the weight of his own hypocrisy pressed down on him, a heavy cloak concealing his true feelings. As Mrs. Gable spoke, David forced a comforting smile, reciting familiar verses of hope and assurance. Yet, the words felt hollow, like a performance devoid of genuine emotion. The week dragged on, filled with restless nights and blank pages. David's study became a battleground, the sermon an elusive prize he couldn't grasp. Seeking solace, David wandered into the church's rose garden, a place his father had cherished. The vibrant colours of the blooming roses offered a brief respite from his inner turmoil. There, amidst the fragrant blooms, he found Mrs. Gable tending to her tulips. Her presence, a familiar comfort, eased his troubled spirit. In a moment of vulnerability, David confessed his doubts and fears to Mrs. Gable, shedding the pretense of spiritual perfection. Mrs. Gable's simple analogy of a gardener tending to weeds resonated deeply within David's heart, offering a new perspective on faith and imperfection. Her words offered acceptance, not judgment, understanding, not perfection. David found solace in her wisdom, a beacon of hope in his sea of doubt. David realized his congregation didn't need a flawless pastor, but an honest one who could stand with them amid doubt and struggle. The weight of pretense lifted from his shoulders, replaced by a newfound sense of freedom. He returned to his desk with a renewed sense of purpose. His sermon transformed, rooted in honesty and vulnerability. He would share his own fears and allow space for others' doubts. Sunday arrived, the church filled with familiar faces. David's voice, steady and sincere, carried through the sanctuary, echoing with newfound authenticity. He spoke of faith as the courage to keep walking even when the path is unclear. His words resonated with the congregation, creating a space of shared understanding. David shared his own struggles, emphasizing the importance of tending to our hearts and each other, pulling weeds and nurturing new growth. The silence that followed was filled with understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the complexities of faith. In that moment, David felt a peace deeper than any sermon he had ever preached before. The empty pulpit was no longer a place of fear, but a space of honest connection, where burdens could be laid down and hearts could blossom anew. Mrs. Gable smiled at David from the pews. David smiled back. The two had become unlikely friends and spiritual confidants. After the sermon, many of the congregation came up to David and hugged him. They thanked him for his honesty. David looked at Mrs. Gable and she gave him a knowing nod. The garden began to bloom as well, both inside and outside the church. David and Mrs. Gable looked at the garden together with a sense of peace. Now, the church was a symbol of honesty. The garden of peace had finally arrived. David and Mrs. Gable knew that more good could come with their newfound strength. "We're in this together," Mrs. Gable would say to David when his anxiousness would return. "We must lift each other up in our trying times." Now David was finally able to take the next steps in building a community around the church. All thanks to Mrs. Gable and his newfound faith. And so, the church bloomed in many ways. David and Mrs. Gable kept in close contact, forever friends until the end of time.